Chapter 10 The Great Shooting Party. As soon as the doctor had driven away from the filling station, I went into the office and got out the sign that said, "Sorry, closed." I hung it on one of the pumps and I headed straight for the caravan. I was too tired to undress. I didn't even take off my dirty old sneakers. I just flopped down on the bunk and went to sleep. The time was 5 minutes past 8 in the morning. More than 10 hours had passed. More than 10 hours later, at 6:30 in the evening, I was woken up by the ambulance men bringing my father back from the hospital. They carried him into the caravan and laid him on the lower bunk. "Hello, Dad," I said. "Hello, Danny. How you feeling?" "A bit woozy," he said, and he dozed off almost immediately. As the ambulance men drove away, Doc Spencer arrived and went into the caravan to take a look at the patient. "He'll sleep until tomorrow morning," he said. "Then he'll wake up feeling fine." I followed the doctor out to his car. "I'm awfully glad he's home," I said. The doctor opened the car door, but he didn't get in. He looked at me very sternly and said, "When did you last have something to eat, Danny?" Something to eat? I had a..." Suddenly I realised how long it had been. I hadn't eaten anything since I had had supper with my father the night before. That was nearly 24 hours ago. Doc Spencer reached into the car and came out with something huge and round wrapped in wax paper. "My wife asked me to give this to you," said. "I think you'll like it. She's a fine cook." He pushed the package towards me and then he jumped into the car and drove quickly away. I stood there clasping the big round thing tightly in my hands. I watched the doctor's car as it went down the road and disappeared around the curve. And after it had gone, I stood there watching the empty road. After a while I turned and walked back up the steps into the caravan with my precious parcel. I placed it in the centre of the table, but I didn't unwrap it. My father lay on the bunk in a deep sleep. He was wearing hospital pyjamas. They had brown and blue stripes. I went over and gently pulled back the blanket to see what they had done to him. Hard white plaster covered the lower part of his leg and the whole of his foot except for his toes. There was a funny little iron thing sticking out below his foot, presumably for him to walk on. I covered him up again and returned to the table. Very carefully I now began to unwrap the wax paper from around the doctor's present, and when I had finished I saw before me the most enormous and beautiful pie in the world. It was covered all over, top, sides and bottom, with rich golden pastry. I took a knife from beside the sink and cut out a wedge. I started to eat it in my fingers, standing up. It was a cold meat pie. The meat was pink and tender with no fat or gristle in it, and there were hard-boiled eggs buried like treasures in several different places. The taste was absolutely fabulous. When I had finished the first slice, I cut another and ate that too. God bless Dr. Spencer, I thought, and God bless Mrs. Spencer as well. The next morning, a Monday, my father was up at 6 o'clock. "I feel great," he said. He started hobbling around the caravan to test his leg. "It hardly hurts at all," he cried. "I can walk you to school." "No," I said, "no. I've never missed one yet, Danny." "It's 2 miles each way," I said. "Don't do it, Dad, please." So that day I went to school alone, but he insisted on coming with me the next day. I couldn't stop him. He had put a woolen sock over his plaster foot to keep his toes warm, and there was a hole in the underneath of the sock so that a metal thing could poke through. He walked a bit stiff-legged, but he moved as fast as ever, and the metal thing went clink on the road every time he put it down. And so life at the filling station returned to normal, or anyway, nearly to normal. I say nearly because things were definitely not quite the same as they had been before. The difference lay in my father. A change had come over him. It wasn't a big change, but it was enough to make me certain that something was worrying him quite a lot. He would brood a good deal, and there would be silences between us, especially at supper time. Now and again I would see him standing alone and very still out in front of the filling station, gazing up the road in the direction of Hazel's Wood. Many times I wanted to ask him what the trouble was, and had I done so, I'm sure he would have told me at once. In any event, I knew that sooner or later I would hear all about it. I hadn't long to wait. After about 10 days, after his return from the hospital, the two of us were sitting out on the platform of the caravan, watching the sun go down behind the big trees on the top of the hill across the valley. We had our supper, but it wasn't my bedtime yet. The September evening was warm and beautiful and very still. "You know what makes me so hopping mad?" he said to me all of a sudden. "I get up in the mornings feeling pretty good. Then around 9 o'clock every single day of the week, that huge silver Rolls Royce comes swishing past the filling station, and I see the great big bloated face of Mr. Victor Hazel behind the wheel. I always see it. I can't help it. And as he passes by, he always turns his head in my direction and looks at me. But it's the way he looks at me. It's so infuriating. There is a sneer under his nose and a smug little smirk around his mouth, and although I only see him for 3 seconds, it makes me madder than mackerel. What's more, I stay mad for the rest of the day. I don't blame you, I said. A silence fell between us. I waited to see what was coming next. I'll tell you something interesting, he said at last. The shooting season for pheasants started on Saturday. Did you know that? No, Dad, I didn't. It always starts on the 1st of October, he said, and every year Mr. Hazel celebrates the occasion by giving a grand opening day shooting party. I wondered what this had to do with my father being madder than a mackerel, but I knew for certain there would be a connection somewhere. It's a very famous event, Danny, that shooting party of Mr. Hazel's. Do lots of people come, I asked. Hundreds, he said. They come from miles around. Dukes and lords, barons and baronets, wealthy businessmen and all the fancy folk in the country. They come with their guns and their dogs and their wives, and all day long the noise of shooting rolls across the valley. But they don't come because they like Mr. Hazel. Secretly, they all despise him. They think he's a nasty piece of work. Then why do they come, Dad? Because it's the best pheasant shoot in the south of England. That's why they come. But to Mr. Hazel, it's the greatest day of the year, and he's willing to pay almost anything to make it a success. He spends a fortune on those pheasants. Each summer he buys hundreds of young birds from the pheasant farms and puts them in the woods where the keepers feed them and guard them and fatten them up ready for the great day to arrive. Do you know, Danny, that the cost of rearing and keeping one single pheasant up to the time when they're ready to be shot is equal to the price of 100 loaves of bread? It's not true. I swear it, my father said. But to Mr. Hazel, it's worth every penny of it. And you know why? It makes him feel important. For one day in the year, he becomes a big cheese in the little world, and even the Duke of So-and-so slaps him on the back and tries to remember the first name when he says goodbye. My father reached out a hand and scratched the hard plaster just below his left knee. It itches, he said. The skin itches underneath the plaster, so I scratch the plaster and pretend I'm scratching the skin. Does that help? No, he said, it doesn't help. But listen, Danny. Yes, Dad, I want to tell you something. He started scratching away again at the plaster on his leg. I waited for him to go on. I want to tell you what I would dearly love to do right now. Here it comes, I thought. Here comes something big and crazy. I could tell something big and crazy was coming simply from watching his face. It's a deadly secret, Danny. He paused and looked carefully all around him. And although there was probably not a living person within 2 miles of us at that moment, he now leaned close to me and lowered his voice to a soft whisper. I would like, he whispered, to find a way of poaching so many pheasants from Hazel's woods that there wouldn't be any left for the big opening shoot on October the 1st. Dad, I cried, no! Shh, he said, listen. If only I could find a way of knocking off a couple of 100 birds all in one go, then Mr. Hazel's party would be the biggest washout in history. 200, I said, that's impossible. Just imagine, Danny, he went on. What a triumph. What a glorious victory that would be. All the dukes and lords and famous men would arrive in their big cars, and Mr. Hazel would strut about like a peacock, welcoming them and saying things like, plenty of birds out there for you this year, Lord Thistlethwaite. And dear Sir Godfrey, this is a great season for pheasants, a very great season indeed. And then out they would all go with their guns under their arms, and when they would take up positions surrounding the famous wood. And inside the wood, a whole army of hired beaters would start shouting and yelling and bashing away at the undergrowth to drive the pheasants out of the woods towards the waiting guns. And lo and behold, there wouldn't be a single pheasant to be found anywhere. And Mr. Victor Hazel's face would be redder than a boiled beetroot. Now, wouldn't that be the most amazing and beautiful thing if we could pull it off, Danny? My father had gotten himself so worked up that he rose to his feet and hobbled down the caravan steps and started pacing back and forth in front of me. Wouldn't it, though, he shouted. Wouldn't it be beautiful? Yes, I said. But how, he cried. How could it be done? There's no way, Dad. It's hard enough getting just 2 birds up in those woods, let alone 200. I know that, my father said. It's the keepers that make it so difficult. How many are there, I asked. Keepers? 3, and they're always around. Do they stay through the night? No, not through the night, my father said. They go off home as soon as all the pheasants are safely up in the trees roosting. But nobody's ever discovered a way of poaching a roosting pheasant. Not even my own dad, who was the greatest expert in the world. It's about your bedtime, he added. Off you go, and I'll come in and tell you a story.